Jamil. I welcome you to the afternoon panel on how to think about Muslim societies in world history. Before I introduce or I mention the names of four sages of world history literature in America, and literally there's a fifth one, Richard Bulliet, who is here, who's going to be the chair of next panel. But we always some sort of humorously joke that the world history field is developed by non-European historians that needs to have conversations among themselves in American academia, but we have a scholar who's also a European historian, partly. And to preempt a critique that might come to me, so why did I put all world historians in one panel, ghettoize them? I should say that was not intentional, but I wanted us, all of us, to engage in with our world history scholars on alternative frameworks of history, where how we can resituate the history of Muslim societies and what kind of new frameworks we can experiment with and we can offer as an alternative. You do have the biographies of our scholars, so I will start just giving them the floor. I will start with Terry Burke, who teaches University of California system, and Terry will have one of those alternative frameworks. Okay?
Well, that might be expecting a little bit too much, but at least it's a sort of a wave in the direction of the fact that it might be useful for us, among the other ways that we're trying to reframe what we do as part of strategies to present it to others who are not necessarily intimates to our professional conversations among ourselves, to consider thinking about using the Mediterranean as one of those frameworks. And I'm saying this with a certain amount of trepidation because, of course, the Mediterranean as a region is one that has long since been a sort of a trope of historians going back to the ancient period and on forward. Henri Pirenne, Mohammed and Charlemagne, and Goitein, I suppose, and his Mediterranean world have to be mentioned there, but especially, of course, Brodel and his Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II. And these are all important interventions, but none of them address the particular paradox and difficulty of people who are working on the early modern period forward in trying to think about what happens to Middle Eastern societies. And so that's the subject, really, that I want to try and take up here. And it's one that comes from a lot of thinking over the years. I teach both world history and Middle East history. I actually taught French history for the first 10 years that I was at Santa Cruz until we hired somebody who actually knew what he was talking about. And so I have a particular perspective, and as a world historian, one of the things that has frustrated me a lot has been, well, actually there are two things, but one of them has been, consider that, and Jamil just sort of tiptoed up to the edge of this and then didn't quite trace the genealogy for you, that the modern field of world history in the United States is one in which Middle Eastern historians have played a really important role in the creation, right? So I would include in this list William McNeill, obviously Marshall Hodgson, Lieutenant Stavrianos, Carter Findlay, Dick Bulliet, myself, and we could go on and on. I think I'm leaving people out and forgetting them at the moment, and I'm embarrassed to be doing so. Ross Dunn, obviously, is still another one. So there's something about the lands of Islam that sort of constantly leads us off stage as specialists. When I started teaching all these many years ago, I was entrusted with teaching the history of the Middle East, and I was given S.N. Fisher, The Middle East, a History, as my textbook. And I got enormously frustrated with that book because all of the good stuff seemed to happen off stage. Just when you'd get going, people would charge off to India or they'd charge off somewhere else, and you wouldn't have no access, and your students would have no access to the rest of what was going on. And it was at that point that Marshall Hodgson sort of mimeographed copy of Marshall Hodgson's 3 volumes fell into my hands. And I began to understand that there was another way of doing it, although, of course, as a good child of the left at that point, I was deeply suspicious of the whole civilizationist approach that Hodgson was using for reasons both good and bad, I think. In the end, I came around to thinking that if you're teaching undergraduates, the civilizational approach actually is a very useful one, and it is, moreover, the basis around which much of what passes for world history these days was actually created. So we use a sort of a civilizational frame as a way of doing it. I think there are pedagogical reasons why this is an approach that has value, even if it is also an approach that has been heavily criticized by myself and Ross Dunn and David Christian and a bunch of other people besides. So anyway, let me just try and develop some rationales for why it is that I think that the Mediterranean might be due for a reconceptualization, and the modern Mediterranean in particular, right? And I want to make sort of three related kinds of interventions, three different kinds of strategies. And so the first one actually was something that came out of a conversation I had with a Chinese historian colleague of mine, on which I was talking vaguely about the difficulty of putting the Middle East into world history. Again, sad but true. When I teach the history, teach world history, mostly I leave the Middle East out, and I leave it out for reasons that are both unfortunate and also the product of trying to put in so much already, and it's just too complex, and you can't possibly get to first base with your students at the same time, and the same processes that you're trying to illustrate actually happen more cleanly in some other space, right? So that's, anyway, that would be my defense. I don't know that it's a valid one or carries much weight, but in any event, there it is. So anyway, what the first strategy is, it comes out of this conversation, and it's basically that the Mediterranean is not a lot of places, it's one place. I mean, here we are back to our unity and variety theme, I suppose, and whether we want to embrace that or how we want to deal with that, depends a lot on our disciplinary training, perhaps, and other things as well. But the point here I want to make is a somewhat different one, which is that if you are looking from China at the Mediterranean, then there is one word that embraces Western monotheism. It's oui, right? So anybody who is a Western monotheist. So this puts us in mind that, if you are of a heritage, either Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, right, and you are all too hyper aware of the internal differences within your tribe, and also have only the vaguest notion, having been raised a Catholic, have only the vaguest notion of what it is that divides Protestants, right? So it's just, it's a mystery. And so I think the Chinese have the same problem with the Mediterranean and with Western monotheism, and that's encapsulated in that term. But beyond that, if you think about it for a second, then you realize that the Mediterranean is a somewhat fractured but still unitary space in which there is the heritage of ancient empires, there's Roman law, there's Greek thought, there are these fabled monotheisms, and they are in deep and protracted conflict over the basic terms of the organization. So is empire something that is good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? Is a huge legacy of debate over that very subject. Should we render to Caesar rather than to God? Well, there's a whole debate over that too. And so the ways in which religions intersect with the state is more similar than different, right? The way in which these monotheisms and the debates that they spawn. Similarly, Greek thought provokes all sorts of debates. They come out somewhat differently in the different monotheistic heritages. But they are very different from the kinds of debates, or indeed non-debates, that happen elsewhere in the world once Greek thought gets unleashed on the rest of the world, right? So the Mediterranean, in this sort of deeper cultural perspective, is really one place, is what I want to try and argue, even if a fractured one. Not a fragmented one, but a fractured one, and in which conflict is one of the ways in which it manifests its unity, right? These are struggles over unity, struggles over the terms of the debate, but the terms of the debate remain the same, right? And so that's the essential point. All right, a second strategy, because I could just go on, and I would really refer you to my paper, which is a more considered effort, perhaps, and I'm still very unsatisfied with a lot of the ways in which it's framed, but a considered effort to try and develop it in a longer format, many of the kinds of things that I'm going to be talking about here. So the second one is, if we are thinking about, well, why the Mediterranean, I suppose is the question. If we're thinking about world history, again, one of the things that I noticed is that world historians sort of began to develop these little playgrounds that they were happily romping about in, and one of them was called the Indian Ocean world, And there's a lot of scholarship that has gone on there. Some of you may be aware of this, some of you may only be vaguely in touch with it, but it's been very fruitful and very interesting, and precisely because it cuts across pre-existing cultural and ethnic splits, civilizational splits indeed, and brings things together in new ways. It's productive of all kinds of new and interesting research. And the other obvious big playground, the biggest playground we've got at this point in this way of going after things, is the Atlantic world. And so there's lots of stuff being done on the Atlantic world or within that framework, and lots of debates about the terms of trade. Now, whose Atlantic world is this? Is this a famous white British guy's Atlantic world, or is this the Black Atlantic? You know, do the people who speak Spanish get to play? You know, sort of what is the Atlantic world as a zone of historical interaction, as a zone of comparative historical research, right? So I have been working together with colleagues at the University of California in a research project that has been funded by the UC President's Office called the World History Workshop for the past decade or so. And so I began to watch my various colleagues having such good fun, and I thought, well, damn, we have to be able to have some fun too. And so I thought, well, why don't we just go to the Mediterranean? The Mediterranean has been sort of sitting on the shelf there. We've been leaving it alone. It's toxic. Where Brodel leaves it off, Brodel stops, right? I mean, the interesting thing about Brodel's project is that it sort of is aborted, basically, in the sense that it leaves us with a world that in which the colonial divisions are already pre-inscribed, right? In which, therefore, there is nothing that has to be thought through because it's already there. And that just seems to me very deeply wrong and a way of closing off one's mind and attention just at the moment when it is most needed if we're going to try and think ourselves through the thicket of how it is exactly that Mediterranean societies came to modernity. So that's the dilemma. All right, so the setup for the second approach here, which is I will call the eco-historical approach, is one that is based on a series, I think I boosted this up to about 5 different observations at this point. Let me see if I can briefly summarize. So the first of these is just an observation that if you start in 500 BC and you are doing the demographic history of humanity, or even of just Eurasia, one of the things you will be struck by is that there are 2.5 times as many people in the Mediterranean as there are in China, right? 1/3 of all humanity, according to standard statistical demographic sources, resides in the Mediterranean basin. That is huge, right? And that helps to explain why the classical age is so important, because 1/3 of all humanity lives there. It is a zone of interconnection in which ideas and goods and people can circulate at something approaching warp speed in the context of the ancient world. So obviously a lot slower than we're used to these days, but nonetheless something that in the context of the ancient world was really quite extraordinary. So that's one. And then gradually over time, and you have to draw the demographic, and I'll draw it again at, say, 1500. By this time, I'm going to make up a number, the Mediterranean world, and somewhat, well, we can get into the methodology of how I constructed a demographic profile for the Mediterranean, but this is just a rough heuristic. But India and China around 1500 have populations of around 100 million, a little bit more, a little bit less, depending. And the population of the Mediterranean basin, and again, including the Mediterranean, not the Middle East, so again, note that, is about 64 million. Right, so the steam has come out of this particular balloon. That is because over the longue durée of millennia and millennia of intensive agriculture and so on, the regime, which was not initially well endowed in all of the kinds of important resources that would later need to be put into play, has gradually begun to erode a lot of its agricultural possibilities. So, all right, let me just leave that. So a second thing is to notice that with the voyages, so-called voyages of discovery, 1450 on forward, one of the things that gradually happens, and certainly by 1600 or so we could say that it has really clearly begun to happen, is that the Mediterranean, the place of the Mediterranean in what I'm going to call the topology of global exchange has been shifted, right? So increasingly the North Atlantic and already even before this time, the Indian Ocean world have begun to rival the Mediterranean as a zone of global exchanges. Global exchanges, not just economic, but also ideas and technologies and the like. All right, so the changing topology of the Mediterranean is the second important thing that we have to realize that goes on. A third is that by 1600, certainly by 1700, the Mediterranean has lost two of its four major agro-industrial complexes. Those would be sugar production and cotton production. And the other two major ones are silk and wool, right? And wool is, of course, the biggie. And all of the empires, the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, certainly the Iberian Habsburgs, are based on the wool trade. So also, of course, are the city-states of Renaissance Italy. Brodel does a nice little run-through on how there's something like the Mesta, which is this choreographed movement of sheep, seasonal movement of sheep going on even in Anatolia, et cetera. So there's ways in which we can think about the sort of underlying pastoral basis of the economies of these societies, but also that the bigger point is this one I made first, which is that the cotton production and sugar production, which will become the major crops of the Americas, sugar, of course, sooner than cotton, will emerge as crucial. There are still other factors that one needs to bear in mind. One is the impact of the Little Ice Age on the Mediterranean world, which is there's this wonderful new book called The Waning of the Middle Ages, or the Mediterranean, sorry, interesting and nice slip, that helps us to understand how the Little Ice Age, the changes in climate that are going on from roughly 1350 to 1850 and affect northwestern Europe in particular, are impacting the Mediterranean. It impacts it in a rather different way, but one of the general result is that the agricultural potential of the region is further eroded. A lot of the coastal areas become malarial swamps. They become depopulated. There's a whole series of changes that are set in motion as a result of this that exacerbate and build upon other trends that are already going on, such as the first two that I enumerated. All right, I'm going to leave off there. I'm leaving one of these out because I already have only 2 minutes left, and perhaps even 3. So the next one is to try and think in, or at least to encourage people to think in, excuse me, in new ways about how the Mediterranean comes to modernity. Now, I'm talking about the Mediterranean as a whole and not the Islamic world, and I'm doing that with a purpose, and the purpose is because the whole region, and not just the Muslim parts of it, are economically underdeveloped as a result of these changes I just enumerated. The whole region, and not just part of it, is a zone in which there are largely weak states and overmighty subjects and powerful hinterlands. And so the transformation of the Mediterranean from 1500 on forward is something the whole region undergoes, not just the Ottoman bits or not just the Muslim bits. So if we take that on board, then whatever it is that happens to the Muslim bits is not the result of something that is inbuilt, oh my God, we're Islamic, right? But it might have something to do, and it's not a cultural variable, it has to be something else, right? So what I'm just trying to do is create a little machine that will allow us to try and figure out how much culture matters and how much other things might potentially matter. I can't get into it here, read the paper, but I have a whole sort of a discussion of what's going on politically that is, that's parallel to this. And it has to do with the notions that, let me pause. I'm trying to fit in another thought, which is the impact of Orientalism. All right, and particularly Orientalism, Pache Said, not so much Orientalism, art historians plaything. But Orientalism is a set of spectacles that Northerners use to observe Southerners. And Northern Italians use it to observe Southern Italians. Madrienos use it to observe Castellanos, Andalusinos, and so on. So it's so if the next part of this little machine is to try and figure out how much colonialism mattered and how much being disrespected by one's northern bosses mattered. And so if you play that one out, then you can also understand that guys sitting in Fez are disrespecting people in the Sus, guys sitting in Istanbul are disrespecting people that are in Eastern Anatolia, and so on. So everybody has the Orientalism they deserve, perhaps. But in any event, Orientalism is a game that is played by Mediterraneans about Mediterraneans quite as much as it is one that is played by French and British and Germans against Mediterraneans, right? And so all of the stereotypes that exist about Arabs and Muslims also exist about Italians, about Oriental Jews, about Southern Spanish, and so on. So nonetheless, part of the Mediterranean, mostly the northern part, gets to colonize other parts of the Mediterranean, mostly the southern part. However, modernity, political modernity, diffuses in part against the logic of the movement of bayonets, right? So bayonets impose French code law on Spain and Italy. Bayonets impose French modernity on Spain and Italy. The Ottoman Empire freely adopts aspects of French modernity and imposes it on its own people. Is that colonization? Right? So here you can see I'm beginning to wind up for a nice Donnybrook with Tim Mitchell, Colonizing Egypt, a book that I both love and find very useful to spar with, because he is trying to sell us on the notion that what goes on in Egypt under Muhammad Ali is somehow colonialism, and I'm saying no. Actually, that's not true. It's what elites do to non-elites all over the Mediterranean basin, and has little or nothing to do with colonialism. So partly maybe it's because I'm a North Africanist and therefore sensitive to settler colonialism, in which the actual settler part of it is an operative component. But the displacement of rural populations by non-autochthonous settlers is certainly a very important difference in the experiences of Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, for example, than the experience of Egypt, right? So how much does that matter? What I'm trying to do is construct a game. If you find it useful, then pick it up and use it. I'm not trying to be Wallerstein. I'm not trying to give you a new testament. I'm trying to tell you that there are useful games, comparative historical games, that we can all play together for fun and profit. Thank you.
I'm going to take a different kind of view from what Terry was taking. He utilized a very focused kind of approach. I want to take an approach that, if I want to be elitist in my vocabulary, I will call holistic. Otherwise, sort of one big glob approach. And I want to start with two questions. And I want to identify the two questions by first identifying two questions that I am not dealing with, because we are talking about the period Golden Age and decline, 1300 to 1900. In the popular mind, looking at the Muslim world in that period, the most popular question, earning an author lots and lots of money, is what went wrong? And quite frankly, that is not a very profitable question for, at least from my perspective, for me to talk about, because the answer to what went wrong, so far as I'm concerned, is nothing. Nothing went wrong. What you had was a broad movement of historical change, which is very unproductively identified as going wrong. I mean, what went wrong in the Mediterranean world with Christianity? I mean, God, they lost their religion and converted to some exotic sect from the Eastern Mediterranean. What went wrong with Roman polytheism and so on? That's a stupid question. The other question that puts me a little closer to, so I need to be polite, puts me closer to vocabulary that we all use. I use it and so on. But the other question then is, are the tensions of this period reflecting a clash of civilizations? Now, when I was president of Middle East Studies Association and had the opportunity to give an address, the title of the address was "The End of Civilization is Not So Bad." And quite frankly, again, it may be useful to have a concept civilization. Brodel says a civilization can be identified as a piece of territory on a map. That may have been useful for talking about world history up to about the 15th century, but for our period, using civilizational vocabulary where civilization means a culturally independent, discrete territory with a separate ghetto, the civilizational approach, the Toynbee approach, and so on, are civilizations as discrete ghettos sitting around, and when they interact like billiard balls. So those are not the questions, because I think nothing went wrong, and civilizations died in about the 15th century, at least civilizations as understood even by Samuel Huntington in 1993. So the two questions that I want us to think about are, one, where does the era 1300 to 1900 fit into world history? And two, where does the Islamic world fit into this world historical unit of 1300 to 1900? I told somebody during the break that what I was going to be doing was trying to give a presentation of all of world history from the time of the emergence of Homo sapiens to the present in maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And I think I can do it. When I was a department chair, I always used to tell young faculty when I'd give them a new course, I would say, well, any course that you teach, it shows how technologically old-fashioned I am, any course that you teach should be able to be fully described on a 3x5 card. And if you can't do that, you probably are including extraneous stuff. So if we're asking the question, where does this era, global era, 1300 to 1900 fit into world history? The pattern that I tend to use when I look at world history is to take a narrative theme, which is that human beings in groups live in distinctive lifestyles. And at the very grandest, there have been 4 distinctive human lifestyles. When Homo sapiens emerged, everybody was a gatherer and hunter. Now, they had lots of different kinds of gatherings and huntings, but the basic framework was hunting and gathering. And then a few gatherers and hunters developed a second lifestyle that produced the ability to control plants and animals. And so you had small-scale agricultural communities that were then interacting with the gatherers and hunters. And then some of those small-scale agricultural communities discovered ways of living together in big groups, cities. And so you had the urban revolution and large-scale agricultural societies. And then with this emergence, from basically 4,000 years ago up until about the middle of our period, the main story, the main underlying story of world history is the interaction of the gatherers and hunters, the small-scale agriculturalists, and the large-scale urban agriculturalists. Now, if we then look at our period, all of these groups are still there, but they're each changing. And for Muslims in this pattern, there weren't, maybe somebody can find some for me, but I don't think there were any Muslim gatherers and hunters. But there were lots of Muslims who lived in small, separated agricultural communities, either as nomadic communities or as settled peasant communities. And then you had the most visible, the stuff that we talked about before lunch, the really big urban agricultural societies that had a shared thing, however much they might have been interconnected or not interconnected and so on, the Safavids, the Ottomans, and the Mughals. And Askia Muhammad and the Songhai and Aceh, everything from Java to Senegal, were large urban agricultural societies. And one of the big dynamics then was, in our period, was the ending of the ability of the small-scale nomadic communities to gain control over large-scale urban societies. So at any rate, we have that as our kind of saying. Now, as one looks then at modernity, again, we got hints this morning about some people are comfortable using the term early modern, some people are not comfortable with the term early modern. Somebody like Jack Goldstone has this lovely article on the problem of early modern, and he says early modern is like the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, and early modern is neither early nor modern. Now what you have is, in this period, you have a distinctive mode emerging of large-scale urban agricultural societies. These are different from the large-scale urban agricultural societies of the classical period, or in European terms, the medieval period. These are the communities that are now already beginning to be embedded in non-civilizationally bounded grand global networks. So that Jamal's Coffee is a marvelous example of an Islamic involvement. I mean, the coffee shops and those kind of inventions, but just the coffee itself starts in Yemen. Nobody could grow coffee before they stole trees from Yemen. But the next major place for producing coffee was another Muslim area. It was Java. The coffee growing was transforming the way that the Javanese economy was going. And so you have then lots of interconnections. Nobody worried that Java was a post-Hindu Buddhist civilization interacting with a traditional Islamic society of Yemen. That doesn't enter into the category. But you have the consumption revolution. And I really desperately want that picture of the three. But you have the consumption revolution of chocolate, of coffee, of tea, and of sugar, and I would add potatoes. And the consumption revolution meant that the common life, it wasn't just elite interaction, the common life of people, really starting in the 15th and 16th century, had many things that were similar across the board, and so that popular culture within what might have been identifiable as civilizations was beginning to have many, many different kinds of links. So that I would suggest that what we're dealing with in our period is a distinctive mode, a distinctive phase in the history of large-scale urban agricultural societies, with the characteristics that they are globalized, they are increasingly globalized, they are increasingly commodified, and so on. Now, given my interest being more in religious history, I would just like to say it's also distinctive in religious history. That as we look at this broad span of the history of large-scale urban societies, we've had a couple of people who started back in, say, 500, 600 BCE, the so-called axial period. Islam comes out of, oh good, I've got 5 minutes, wow, okay. Islam comes out of the axial traditions defining the way that people had their worldviews and so on operational. Axial religions go through phases. You have the prophetic, imaginative, initiatory phase. You have the consolidation phase, so that the canonization of the tradition. And then you have the pulling back from the canonization of tradition. And in most of the great traditions in world history, in this kind of period just before our period, you had what I would call neo-axialisms emerging. You have Neo-Confucianism, you have a consolidation of Middle Eastern monotheism with Ghazali, you have what should we call it, neo-monotheism of Ghazali and Maimonides and so on. When we get to our period, though, people are tired of these sort of big things, and so you have the Reformation, you have people reacting to these grand structures, but neither Luther nor the big figures in 16th, 17th, and 18th century Islamic thought, none of them were either medieval, quote medieval, but none of them were modern. What we have is a distinctive world, a distinctive lifestyle that is, because we now know that that period came to an end, it was the last of the dominant of having large-scale urban societies, urban agricultural societies being dominant. In that, our empires were really at the center of this new phase of large-scale urban agricultural society. They were clearly not what had come before. They were clearly not medieval, but neither were they modern, any more than the Habsburg were modern. And so as we look then at this world in this world period, that where does 1300 to 1900 fit into world history? It fits in as a distinctive time in the development, and as it works out, in the end of the dominance of large-scale urban agricultural societies. And within that framework, the Islamic world is a very important part in terms of the commodification and the popularization, and in reflecting the religious trends as well. And you notice I didn't even mention gunpowder empires or anything like that, because I know Dick is down there and it would be fun to talk about gunpowder empires. But at any rate, this then is my kind of generic answer to these two questions. Where does the era fit into world history, and where does the Islamic world fit into this period? And I would just sort of close again where I started. And this account, this narrative, doesn't even bother with the question of what went wrong, because that question is irrelevant. Doesn't even bother with the question of the clash of civilizations, because that subject is irrelevant. What we are talking about is the long-term development of global history as it emerged in this period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamil. And while I'm thanking Jamil, maybe we can take just a moment to reflect on the fact that 100 or so people don't just accidentally find themselves in the same room as we do here. There is a huge amount of organization and logistics and planning and so forth that has to precede our presence here. So I would just like to thank Jamil. And Susan Douglas, I understand, has been putting in some overtime to make this happen, and I'm sure there are also others whose names we have not yet encountered. But thanks to all of you for organizing this grand project. And these are two very interesting takes from Terry and John on the questions that we have for today. Both of them I find to be complementary to what I wanted to say, but in the normal manner of things, historians start at one point and make their own trails, and even if they're somewhat parallel, they take different paths. What I would like to do is think about the experience of another field that has had to extricate itself from a similar narrative, and that's the field of China. The way understanding of China has really been transformed over the past generation or so, partly through what Terry called comparative historical games, which is a felicitous term. And so thinking about that and how it came about may be useful for purposes of people pursuing a similar project in the case of Islam. And then finally, I'll try to sketch very briefly, not a final answer or anything like that, but something that maybe is on the way to thinking about a reframing of the questions and the experiences. At the moment, though, I don't think we're quite ready for reframing. The title of the session asks us to reframe, but I don't think we are quite ready to do that. Some of the groundwork is already in place, but there probably is a fair amount yet to do before a persuasive reframing is possible. It takes a good deal of groundwork, after all, to reframe us out of the assumptions that we all inherit having to do with, quote, modernity. And it took a long time for that to happen in the case of China. A couple of things had to happen along the way. First, there had to be let's call it a destructive phase. A phase of myth-busting. A phase when all of the grand assumptions, mostly Weberian, but maybe some others as well, had to get discarded. Phase when you had to clear out a lot of conceptual underbrush so that some more positive or realistic or some better way of thinking about things could take place. Now in the case of China, I mean, some of the issues that need myth busting are similar in both cases, but we're talking about issues, assumptions, theories, conceptions of things like Oriental despotism, the notion that there was somehow a lack of curiosity in Chinese society, the notion that there was an aversion to risk-taking behavior, a supposed aversion to trade. Adam Smith said, and this is very close to a direct quote, that the Chinese hold foreign commerce in the utmost contempt. This is in The Wealth of Nations. I mean, how could he have been so wrong? I mean, we kind of know how he was so wrong, but it's remarkable that somebody could say something that was so completely wrong. Well, it took a generation or so of empirical scholarship for historians to pull the rug out from under these myths. When it comes to Islam, just let me mention a few things, maybe a little bit more specific things, quite apart from generalized notions of Oriental despotism and so forth, but a little bit more specific things that I would love to see somebody myth bust. How many times, well, look, I'm preaching to the converted here because almost everybody here knows this, but you go 50 or 100 yards away and it's going to be a totally different situation. How many times have you run into this idea that Mr. Al-Ghazali made rational thinking impossible in the Islamic world because there's so much emphasis on faith and revelation and so forth that there is no oxygen left for rational thinking. I mean, this is just ridiculous on the face of it, but you can still see expressions of this kind of thing. How about, by the way, last night, I'm so glad I ran into Ahmed Rahim, who told me that he's going to bust that myth, and and in fact that he's already done it. It just hasn't appeared in print yet. Well, I'm waiting for it eagerly. And I hope that there will be plenty of people joining him in the effort. Another myth thing that needs busting up, the madrasas evidently didn't allow any teaching of science or rational thought. I read that in a book published, it must have been 2010 rather than 2011. I've read about 2/3 of it now. Has anybody seen Toby Huff's book? Intellectual Curiosity and the Scientific Revolution. And I mean, I read this and I cannot even believe what I'm reading. Now, I don't know enough to to explain to the larger world how this is wrong and how it's going wrong. But, you know, I'm pretty sure that there's a problem with his formulation of the curriculum of the madrasas. So that's another myth. I would love to see some guys, some scholars out here. I mean, you guys are the experts who can be taking this on and communicating it to a larger public. That's as important as anything else. Because if the knowledge is confined to this room, that's wonderful for us, but it's not helpful for purposes of reframing the understanding of this whole part of the world. Following or maybe alongside the destructive phase of the project, the myth busting, there needs to be also a constructive phase, and this involves the carrying out of basic research and the accumulation of empirical information that makes it possible to build better ways of thinking about things and makes it impossible for the myths to survive or to return. There are some straws already in the wind. Just by sheer accident, I sat down this morning next to Stephen Dale, who published this marvelous book on the Indian merchants and Eurasian trade. It's one I have my seminar read every year. Here we have a constructive discussion of an actual example of a family and a firm of family and companions who, no, they're not the East India Company or the VOC, but they were active agents going out there in the world and conducting trade. This totally undermines the old notion that the three magical empires didn't care anything about maritime trade, or, well, in this case it wasn't maritime trade, but they cared more about their agricultural productivity. One of these guys, these merchants Dale talks about, was living up there in Moscow, and he had the gleam in his eye of opening a branch on the Baltic. So we're not talking East India Company, but we're talking some pretty ambitious and pretty impressive organizers among this group of merchants. Another example, a straw in the wind, a case of a kind of positive empirical study that can provide the foundation for better ways of thinking about things, is just behind Dale. There's Giancarlo Casale, and he has this great new book on the Ottoman age of exploration that I mentioned in my response to one of the questions here, with 5 questions that we all addressed. Now, does this mean when we find something that is more or less parallel to European experience that we have to expect the same thing? No. Dale's merchants aren't the same as the VOC, and Casale's Ottoman explorers in the Indian Ocean region are not the same as the Iberian and later the Dutch and the English and the others, but there are people who are taking advantage of the resources available and doing something in their own way for their own purposes, and it becomes a part of a package that allows us to think about the world in a different way. Just very, very quickly, Jakob Burckhardt thought that the development of the individual is something that you find in the Italian Renaissance. And so here we have the beginning of the modern subject, which is a European phenomenon. But just this morning, Professor Neji was telling us about Sinan's autobiography and his self-representations. Well, that's fascinating. I mean, so this is the kind of empirical foundation that can serve also as the foundation for thinking positively about another part of the world. All right, so what are the results going to be of all of this? The provisional explanation when it comes to China, after playing this comparative historical game that Terry mentioned, is Ken Pomerantz's book, The Great Divergence. Fascinating book. It's probably not the last word on the subject, but it's quite fascinating for its ability to deal with China and Europe in a balanced comparative way. He finds what he calls a world of surprising similarities. I've always thought that was a great phrase, and I've always also thought that it would be nice if maybe we had a little bit of attention also to the unsurprising differences between the different worlds that we're talking about, and beyond that, to the crucial connections or interactions between them. This is the kind of approach that could enable someone to do the real reframing of the Islamic societies. And I'll just quickly offer up, since it's gotten so much attention already today, the concept of early modernity as one that can be useful for purposes of this period. Now, I understand Nelly Hannah's problems with the term mentioned earlier. They're very similar to the problems that Jack Goldstone articulated in his own work. I must have been sleeping when I sent in the suggested readings. I think I forgot my article called Early Modern Europe and the Early Modern World. I really should have mentioned that one because it deals with a lot of these issues, and it tries to, among other things, tries to characterize an early modern world as a messy place where there are several identifiable large-scale processes at work, but guess what? They have different effects in different places. Just because you don't arrive at a particular destination doesn't mean that you're not a part of early modernity. So here's where we can pick up John Voll's perspective on things and try to understand the Islamic world as well as Europe and the Americas and China, and all the other places as a part of a stage in which there is truly, literally global interaction and processes that touch everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me add my words of amazement and appreciation to Jamil, the whole assemblage of people who've pulled together this wonderful meeting. I do want to send a special word of appreciation and encouragement to Susan Douglas, who's finishing up dissertation or dissertation research in any case on a heroic and nonetheless doable thesis. It's congratulations to both advisor and advisee on this. So I'll give my version of the reframing of narratives with or without qualifications on it. Let me mention as briefly as I can that I've recently published a history of the African diaspora, 1400 to the present, and by that meaning sub-Saharan Africa and the diaspora in the Old World and the New World, that is to say, including North Africa, West Asia, South Asia, Indian Ocean, so forth. And that has made me think about the question of the African diaspora and modernity. But let me stop at that point and say that I will launch into a chronology which is rather like the second of the questions that John Voll is answering, as opposed to those he's not answering. So I'll divide it into two periods, an era of from 1200 to 1650, which I'm going to label an era of global interactions. It's dominated at the beginning by the Mongols. They certainly shook things up. And it finishes up with the mariners circulating throughout the oceans of the world by that time. I think that in this time period from the 14th to the 17th century that the total population of the world may actually have declined. The losses in population because of the Black Death were immense in the early part, and the losses of population in the Americas later on were immense, and there were certainly also some declines in population, maybe not as dramatic in the Old World in the period after discovery of the Americas. So there's my first period. And then the second period, 1650 to 1850, and I'm calling it an era of a world system without hyphen. It's bigger than a Wallersteinian world system. It's seen as one that draws on some of those visions, but that includes the planet. This is a time of expanded production, dramatic increases in trade. This is the time when slavery really grows. And it ends with the Great Divergence in 1850. Thank you, Ken Pomerantz. This also is right in the middle of the time of the Tanzimat, or it's the time of the 1857 uprising in India. So to go period by period and begin with a time period from 1200 to 1350, the Mongols were successful in creating the sort of a steppe-based empire that had been tried numerous times before. They managed to seize the expanding wealth being produced throughout Eurasia. And an interesting link further than where the Mongols were, one can think all the way to West Africa and to Mali, where that state rose at the same time as the Mongol state. And so you can think of a great trading route that did open up in the mid-13th century, a gold end of it in West Africa, a Mediterranean line, and then the Silk Road all the way to East China. This also was a time of change in the sea routes. Srivijaya comes to an end at this point. That fascinating invasion of Java by Kublai Khan in 1293 shook things up in that part of the world, and it's following that Majapahit comes to dominate for some time the politics and arguably the trade of the South China Sea and the Eastern Indian Ocean. So no further details on that very exciting period. The 1350, the time of the Black Death, you know, more research is pouring in on it. It started in China. It's analyzed in great detail in its time, in its movement from the Black Sea to Europe and so forth, but it's now understood that all of the Middle East was hit by it. The debate on just how heavily South Asia was hit. More and very scattered sort of research is suggesting that not just the Red Sea coast of Africa, but maybe all across the African savanna was hit by it. And that, of course, is a result of a huge amount of interconnection up until that time, and of course it cuts interconnection for some time thereafter. So I'll zip next to the period from 1350 to 1500, which I want to label for the moment as that of post-Mongol states, thinking especially of the Timurids. So Timur gets started at 1370. The Golden Horde is still remains in strong position. This is when the Ming start up. In much the same time period, the Ottoman state expands, the Safavid state forms, the Russian Empire expands eastward, the Mughal state is formed. So I sort of take as an image of this time period Timur and Ibn Khaldun having their conversation outside the walls of Damascus. But if we move the time frame a little bit later and go say from 1450 to 1550, we can say this is a time when there were more empires, or maybe a larger proportion of the world's population under empire than at any other time. The Ming state had already formed. The Ottoman state really expands in 1453. One could even try to toss in the formation of the Sultanate of Malacca. I would underscore the importance of Songhai in West Africa, formed in the 1460s and it survived to 1590s. both the rise and the collapse of that state are of considerable importance for Islamic history and of capital importance for the history of sub-Saharan Africa. But the Safavids, Russia, Portugal, Spain, the Mughals, all of this is happening. And this overlaps with the oceanic exchange of this era, the beginning of the 15th century, with the Chinese and Malay and Arab mariners of the eastern seas, and then of the Iberian mariners linking all of this up. So the point, obviously, of my whole framework is to link the great expansion and interconnection on land with that at sea in this 4.5 century period. So by now I get to the contact with the Americas, to the great exploitation of wealth by the Iberian visitors there, but also the region's population decline. And then I'll pick that date that Flynn and Heraldus like to emphasize, 1571, the first Spanish galleon, as the flow of silver from Mexico to Asia completes the circuit around the world and begins a several century period of global silver trade. Now, to look back at this period from 1200 to 1650, we can talk not just about these political events, but one can suggest that there were spiritual and cultural responses to this global shakeup. Right? That the period results in the construction of an expanded sort of hierarchy. And then with that come challenges to authority, challenges to Catholic priesthood, challenges to the ulama, challenges to rabbis. The global framework is there. We've already been reminded about Jahangir's throne name. Mysticism, the need to contact God directly, appears to people in many times and places, and is arguably connected to this shakeup in the very foundation of the world, or for that matter, the fact that one now knows the limits of the world. And there are restatements of authority in this time period. So it's remarkable that in the mid 16th century, the time of the Council of Trent, as the Catholic Church reestablishes its order, this is the time when the Ottoman Empire is strengthening its hold over the Hijaz and building up the Hajj and their leadership in the Hajj. This is a time of dramatic changes in warfare, remarkable expansions in literacy. We've heard a lot about that. Nobles, individuals and groups of them, are at once created and restrained. All of this without speaking of the cultural exchanges of the period. I guess we can use potatoes as an example for that. And another thing that strikes me, in a time from 1500 or 1550, the religions that expand are Christianity and Islam, and no longer the other major religions. Okay, let me look much more briefly at the period from 1650 to 1850, and to point to the expansion in commerce in this area, so silver as a lubricant of commerce throughout the world, growing production and trade in textiles, in silk and cotton and linen, in ceramic, and sugar, spices, coffee, and with that a labor demand. So there was an expansion in slavery in the 15th and early 16th century, but it was 15th, 16th, and early 17th century. It's the mid-17th century that it really expands. That's when the big expansion of slave production in the Americas takes place. It's also a time when there's arises a very good, it'll work. A very active slave trade in Bay of Bengal, from Arakan back and forth to the Ganges Valley. There's also a time when enslavement expands dramatically in Morocco under the realm of Mulay Ismail, as he simply enslaves the people of sub-Saharan African descent, makes them into his army, and arguably introduces a racial dimension to a level that it did not exist in slavery in the Islamic world. So, but another thing about the 17th century is it's certainly a time of a formation of another set of major states, but one could put this in the frame of political reform. States that now understand that they're in a growing, sort of at last systematized and recovering world, and wanting to control things effectively. And so arguably the Tokugawa regime in Japan was a sophisticated way of creating peace and quiet. The Qing regime in China set up bureaucracy in a way that gave substantial attention to social welfare and managed social tensions effectively. That the Dutch and the English constitutional efforts were ways of balancing off the influences of nobles and merchants, and that the French and Russian versions of how to organize things in terms of an absolutism where the monarchy establishes steady supremacy over both nobles and merchants. These are experiments that are developed at much the same time, and all of them succeed for a good while. Some last longer than others. The earlier established empires, the Spanish, the Portuguese, Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal states, are put in a responsive position, and their acts of reform are arguably not as extended nor as successful. My chronology says I'll go up to 1850, but I'm not going to. I'll spare you the last century of that. And just to say that as a wrap up, this narrative is an emphasis on the whole Islamic world. All right, that's as a parallel to and an alternative to, not intended as a substitution for the three empires paradigm, but there's a good narrative of this period that really emphasizes the whole of the Islamic world. And then at the same time, it's an attempt to integrate the Islamic world into a worldwide interpretation. And with special thanks to Dr. Nisipolu for her very elegant handling of chronology this morning, that it's an approach that relies very heavily on chronology. Thank you.
Richard Bulliet again from Columbia. In an earlier iteration of this program, I was going to be on this panel, and for personal reasons, it was unclear I was going to be able to attend right up until last week. So I'd like to ask the indulgence of the chair to make maybe 5 minutes of comments.
Just a couple of minutes, sure.
And focusing around 4 or 5 points. First one takes off from Terry Burke's presentation about the Mediterranean, a, quote, somewhat fractured but still unitary space, which is a nice construction of it. I would like to see the Sahara treated in exactly the same way as the Mediterranean. We have taken the Sahara as a somewhat fractured but still unitary space that divides, and we do not methodologically approach it as one that unites. And I think there is a pulse over time between linking across the Sahara or around the Sahara and using the Sahara as a separation, just as there's a pulse in Mediterranean history. And North Africa is in that sort of isthmus between the two, the water desert and the land desert. And I think that we have bought into sort of the French notion that the Mediterranean is a unity, but there's a difference between French West and Equatorial Africa versus the l'Afrique Blanche. And I think it's time that we did Saharan history in a world historical fashion instead of a colonial fashion. I would also note that taking 25 degrees north latitude is the division between the north and the south in the Muslim world, that goes right through the Sahara Desert, and that we should be erasing that, or at least problematizing that. Secondly, to me, the most important topic that is not studied, not entirely ignored, but not studied in a world historical context over time, is the story of the Hajj. There is nothing like it anywhere in the world. 14 centuries of devotion going to one place, and everyone looks at it as a constant. and it is not. There is a profound change in the Hajj that takes place that begins to take place around 1200. Actually, it begins with Salahuddin al-Ayyubi and is developed by the Mamluks and the Ottomans. The Hajj becomes the center of the Ummah, and essentially my argument is that the Hajj replaces Khilafah, that the Caliph disappears and the Hajj replaces the notion of Khilafah as the center of the Ummah, particularly for the Muslim South, which never, for the most part, knew any caliphs, and most of them convert after the disappearance of the caliphate. We have a good book by Soraya Farouqi about the Ottomans and the Hajj. We have a nice survey by Frank Peters that focuses again on the later period. But the fact of the matter is that before 1100, Mecca had about 5,000 people, and people came, did their ritual, and left because they couldn't sustain big crowds. And the whole notion that the Hajj is a constant is simply false. The Hajj changes profoundly. And for places like, symbolizing this is the fact that I've been unable to find anyone before roughly 1300 who is called Haji or El-Hajj. As an epithet, that does not show up in the biographical dictionaries that I have spent most of my career reading. And then it becomes ubiquitous, particularly in the outlying areas and in the Muslim South. And being a Haji changes your status in the world after 1300 in a way that making the pilgrimage in 900 did not. Thirdly, going to John's observations about the consumption revolution and the colonial intoxicants and the potato, which is just about as intoxicating as chocolate for some of us. That's very good, but it's happened before. And I would say that looking at the history of cotton in the medieval period, where it utterly transforms the Islamic world, I've written a book on this, so I'm not going to go into detail, but cotton goes from being essentially almost non-existent in the Middle East to being everywhere from Spain to Central Asia and becoming the main product and exporting it to Italy. Italy develops a cotton business that's been written about in the late 14th century or 15th century, borrowing all the techniques from the Middle East. And rice is probably another product that would fall in the same category of being a globally universalizing product, but in the time period, substantially before the time period you're referring to. Then finally, going to Pat's periodization, and obviously what he's done about the African diaspora would fit very much into this question of the Sahara, which is, obviously, you've shown that's very important there. The Mongols, when we deal with the history of the New World, we always have this sort of unspoken thing about, the history of the New World under European colonization and domination, you have to factor in somehow that everybody died before, and that you have it's a post-apocalyptic situation, very much the heart of American popular culture now. Not saying everyone was a zombie, but nevertheless, the Europeans built something on an ongoing disaster. I think that it's going to prove that that's how the Mongols expanded into the Middle East. That what I term the Big Chill or the little bitty Muslim Ice Age, there was a climate shift in the 11th century that lasted for about a century and a half, that utterly devastated the economies of Iran, northern Iran, eastern Anatolia, Russia, and it had to do apparently with changes in the albedo that were parallel to the globalization of to the simultaneous medieval warm period in Europe. That snow cover in Siberia seems to have increased the frigidity of that. In any case, I think that we have to realize that the Mongols were not simply the world's best warriors, but they also moved into a post-apocalyptic landscape that had been devastated for a century before they got there. One final comment, that there's this question of, is there a big change in the nature of the Muslim state at some point, and what does it coincide with? Most people feel there is a change. I agree with that. I think there is a big change. The question is when it occurs. And I believe that it is, that it begins, for a complex of reasons I won't go into, in the 12th century, and that all of the later Muslim states, with the possible exception of Iran, do not revolve around, fundamentally around the question of imama. That the whole notion of who is the rightful divinely Muslim, divinely ordained ruler, who is the imam, moves to the side. And the most important title and function of the later rulers, particularly in the north, but not exclusively, really has to do with their, with the usurpation of the old title of the function of the caliph, and encapsulated in the title Khadim al-Haramain, the servitor of the two holy places. This was the main title. This was adopted by Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. It was the main title for the Mamluks, the main title for the Ottomans, and is now the most important title for the Saudi state. And I think that we move from what you might call from imama to khidma as the function of the state. It's not to be the rightfully ordained ruler, but it is to be the ruler who services the religious needs of the Muslim Ummah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I should just reiterate that Richard was supposed to be part of this panel, but for family reasons, there was some suspension, and we really thank him to come here in this very difficult time in his life. And that's why I will not be able to give that privilege to other participants. We will need to keep it. No, this is, we are very happy that you're here. I would like to keep our comments and questions within 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, so that we have more people, because we would like to end by 4 o'clock. So, would you like to, yes?
Thanks for the message. Because I was wondering that there is some generosity here, at least for someone all the way from Manchester, UK. But anyway, I'll try to be very brief, because actually I have a lot to say, and I don't know how I'm going to squeeze it, but hopefully throughout today and tomorrow,
but we have
there may be
reference to your
opportunities.
webpage, in our webpage, so people know.
Well, anyway, first of all, thank you for arranging. It's only about 3 days ago when we knew about this.
Would you please tell your name and the project?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Salim Al-Hassani. I am an emeritus professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Manchester, but I am here because I am chairing a foundation for science, technology, and civilization, which was originally born out of the busting of myths, so Jerry says. We had a Professor Donald Cardwell, who was a world historian of science and technology. He came to me and he said to me, Salim, there is 1,000 years of amnesia in our schools and in the minds of the public. And this amnesia sometimes we name as the Dark Ages or Medieval Ages. So how about you? Because you come from the Middle East and you're a professor of mechanical engineering. You've done everything in your life, and what else are you going to do now? You're best earner in the university. So anyway, to cut a long story short, he was right. We went to look at the books of the schools in maths, physics, biology, chemistry. You name those books in the schools, they do have 1,000 years amnesia. Take, say, physics or maths. You go back, you get to Newton, and then you go further, you might get to Copernicus, perhaps Leonardo da Vinci gets mentioned, and then you get all the way back to Pythagoras. That's the story here. Since this conference here, which has got these galactic people of historians, are interested in reaching or penetrating the popular consciousness, then what messages are you going to be taking from here? Are you going to be taking the same message as historians gave me when I was a young lad? I didn't want to do history because the history it was presented to me was history of people killing each other. It was history of people, of dynasties. And when I refused Donald Cardwell to get into this, he said to me, no, hold on. what you have been told is not really the line you should take. Look at the history of inventions and of scientific innovation. Then you will find out what and he was right. When you look at the history from another route of innovation, of creativeness of human beings, and you will find that it is a totally different history against turbulence, against political domains, and so on. So that's something that we've worked on, and we've got a website called 1001 Inventions, and we've made exhibitions out of the historians' work. We made simple books for the public to read, and we really find that we have created a space for a new space, which is the cultural roots of science as a means of cultural cohesion, social cohesion, and intercultural respect. Now, having said that, because we are interested in uncovering history, presumably to design the future, isn't it? Now we are here, John and Jerry and Edmund, talking about, in fact, even this particular session, this whole forum is about 1300 onwards, and that's when things went wrong, we say, right? Now that means it went right before, wasn't it? I mean, it was right, was it? So if it was right, then why don't we look at how it went, what made it go right, instead of looking at what went wrong? Now, most companies, as we have been taught in industry and in engineering, they, like I think also cultures and civilizations, they have a time curve. They have a rise, a slow rise, an exponential, and then they reach peak, and then they fall down. You could probably do this for each civilization. I think studying what went wrong with the Muslim civilization, right, is only useful for America and the West because it's in the peak and it's going down. So the people who here should be looking at the historical analysis of what went wrong. It should be the American leadership here and the European leadership. If you want to influence the Muslim...
I'm sorry, but can we leave that tomorrow to
Sorry.
George Saliba's panel? I will
Okay,
give you another 2 minutes
I think George will probably have a say. But what I'm trying to say is that
we should
when you talk to the Muslim world, they will say to you, I don't want to know what went wrong, I want to know what went right. Because there is a new paradigm shift now that's happening. And they want to have answers from these historians of what actually went right, not what went wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, this is, of course, one of the big questions that when we wanted to question the argument of decline, we also wanted to question the argument about the golden age. And I think that I really like Rajiv's comment on this, is that it's my right to comment. You know, when we glorify Akbar, we basically set up the trope, because nobody else is as good as Akbar, and in a way that we dehumanizes the rest of the Indian rulers or Indian Muslims. And are we, again, doing the same thing by glorifying an imaginary golden age, which then makes all the other 700 years of Muslims as not up to that standard, which, of course, in many ways is a challenge, but we would like to hear your comments on how else can we reframe this narrative in this broad sweep of world history. Any questions to the speakers? Yes. Ingemin?
I have several questions. I mean, one of them is regarding periodization. I recognize that all the speakers emphasized economic factors. I mean, that pleases me. I taught economic history for 12 years. I mean, but then they sort of tagged on other aspects of human life onto periodization, which is inspired by one or another economic indicator. There may be some problems with this kind of periodization. I want to sort of open that up at some point. I mean, how do we make periodizations? And should we be looking only at measurable, tangible indicators, which is, of course, the case in economic history? But then doesn't that throw us into some other kinds of problems that already came regarding critique of structuralist sort of approach to history? So that is one thing. The other thing I noticed is that all the debates end before the 19th century or really 18th century. I mean, all the presentations. I know Terry pursues the matter into the 19th century in his paper, but he didn't do it here. So what we are left with is that indeed things were going on. There were various things that are perceivable within sort of a larger global history, especially emphasizing economic factors and contacts, and with some throwing in with some other aspects of life related to religion and other things. But indeed, Bernard Lewis's question, what went wrong, is not about the earlier period. It is about the modern period. And indeed, his points, one of his points is, after 1300, things were going okay, but nothing original, nothing creative was happening. I mean, there was, in a sense, another way of putting that there is no history in this period. Whereas in the West, in his West, new things are happening. So his real question is, real creative things were not happening in the Middle East, in the Islamic world. In the Islamic world, he does say Middle East, he thinks in terms of civilization, in terms of Islam. It expanded itself. At best, you can speak of a culmination of certain established sort of patterns. But, so if you want to challenge him, you have to also move into the modern period. But when you go into the modern period, I mean, I can say this because Terry, whether he knows it or not, has influenced my own work tremendously, and everybody knows here that he has made very important contributions into really interventions our field. But that paper about what happened in the modern period is very seriously problematic because it basically repeats some of the things that in your more general papers you say we shouldn't be doing. So what I'm saying is sometimes observing the problem is one thing, then correcting it may call some other kinds of research and research agenda and perhaps deeper reflection on certain issues. But yes, periodization, and why did you stop? I mean, in the early modern period, whatever you want to call it. And then what didn't happen in the Middle East, that indeed it became subservient to Western domination. I mean, one typical example that we give there was, for instance, no mechanisms for capital accumulation in the way it happened in the West. And capital accumulation is crucial in, again, transforming economic things. But I have one other question to another, to me, a very great influential historian, Professor Bulliet. Indeed, I mean, I found this Hajj fascinating. But what about the Christian Hajis? And we know, I mean, their numbers also increased in, say, the Ottoman period, at least I know, and the Jewish Hajis. And there are institutions which supported these Hajj pilgrimages.
They all started around 1300.
Yes, exactly. I mean, but we should sort of bring it in, and what can you add there? That's my question. Thank you.
Now go back to the panel. Any comments, I think Terry and others, on all the earlier?
I think that I hesitate to get into a discussion about my paper and the points that were made because I'm sure it would trespass on the time of others in responding to what's been set up here, and I would like to pursue that privately with the person who raised them. I do say, I mean, I do actually, if you read the paper, you'll see that it actually, something like half of it deals with the 19th century. And I have been, this is just a little thought experiment. Try teaching undergraduates the history of the modern Mediterranean, which I've been doing for the last 10 years. And I start in 1492 and I end in 1942. And the in-house way in which I describe this course is from one dual ethnic cleansing to the other. Right, so it's a way of, what is it about Mediterranean society that problematizes religious forms of otherness, and goes easier on the linguistic ones. Yes, there is the Basque problem in Spain, and yes, there is a Kurdish problem in Turkey, but if you sort of look at it, linguistic otherness is not necessarily stigmatized. So there are ways in which the Middle East comes to modernity that are, that really are, the whole, not the Middle East, I'm sorry, the Mediterranean as a whole, if you expand the game board, And then the place of secularism in all of that, and the sort of militant secularism of Ataturk's Turkey, right, on the one hand, but the militant secularism of France and liberal elites in Spain and Italy as well, right, where nuns and priests are being killed in Spain in the period of the Spanish Revolution, at the same time that things are happening, bad things are happening to Sufi sheikhs and so on in Ataturk's Turkey. So there are these broader kinds of things that maybe there's no way, or maybe you can tell me it's illegitimate for historians to deal with these kinds of questions, but they seem to me to connect to some deeper kinds of cultural substrates that are really interesting and useful to try and explore. I won't say any more than that, but except that I have a two-word answer to Bernard Lewis's question: no coal. There is no coal in the Mediterranean. That means that the Mediterranean as a whole misses out on the whole first round of the fossil fuel revolution. And by the time it gets to round 2 of the fossil fuel revolution, petroleum and natural gas, its oil is no longer its.
Yeah, John?
One of the reasons why I started where I did was to try and emphasize the reframing thing. As an old debater, the important way of winning a debate is to frame your own questions rather than answering the other person's question. And therefore, my answer to the question, what went wrong, is that's a stupid question. Because the instant even you raise coal, then you say, well, they had something else, but you move into the other ground. And that if we are going to get beyond the narratives of decline and so on, we have to be able to try and make them answer our questions rather than us trying to answer their questions.
More questions?
Can I offer just a short response to on the question of the economic or maybe political bias in the narrative? It's an important point, and makes me feel that I assembled my narrative in too big a hurry. One of the issues, one of the real problems in world historical interpretations is they have a really strong elite bias. It's really hard to get past that. We haven't figured out what a global history from below is. But one can at least identify some of the elements that ought to be highlighted. Questions of creativity. Does creativity happen only with great inventions, or is it what keeps people moving at a daily level? Questions in family life. Such things as finance. How finance is, the finance of European finance is written up in great detail. That in the rest of the world, there's a history yet to be done. And then forms of labor, with particular attention, at least in my work, to slavery, questions of popular piety, education, and so forth. And then to get into the 19th century migration, the large-scale migrations of the late 19th century, and how those overlap the various parts of the Islamic world are an interesting place to develop a different interpretation. Thanks.
Yes. We have still 10 to 15 minutes for more questions, please. Ahmed Bey, yes.
This is Ahmed Kara Mustafa from Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm trying to formulate my thoughts on this, but there is, it seems to me, a larger perhaps challenge that you face as world historians, which is that of how do you basically keep in touch with and keep contact with those of us who are perhaps working still within the discipline of history, but in actually regionally based or thematically based areas. And my own, let me give you my own examples, let's say, from my own areas of specialization, which is history of Islam as a quote-unquote religious tradition, and also some history of literature and some history of science. And now, quite a lot of the myth-busting, for instance, needs to be done in the way in which Islam as a religious tradition has been studied and is currently still being studied. So if you attend, as I have been doing, the American Academy of Religion meetings, where Islam is one of the most rapidly growing sections of the Academy, and I think there are a couple others in the room who have, I've seen at AAR, you will see that there Islam is studied, generally speaking, and I don't want to cast aspersions at my colleagues, in a very unhistorical, normative fashion, suffering under the weight of textual scholarship that primarily biases Arabic over against any other kinds of textual sources that we have, which we have in abundance, obviously. And so my question is not really that much of a direct question, but it appears to me that the kind of myth-busting that we need cannot really begin to happen effectively under such time as these myths are busted at the appropriate empirical level, so that you as world historians perhaps then tackle this challenge of experimenting with various different kinds of periodization other than, let's say, economic paradigms or any other large global events that you would like to pin your frameworks on. But when I mention this, I still hesitate, primarily because I find that the gap that separates those of us who study history of religion from the rest of my historian colleagues is so vast, especially in Islam, that I do not really see much of a way out. So I suppose the question is, how does it look from your end? I mean, how do we go about putting our heads together so that I, let's say, just as a person from my own end, try to go about fighting against normativity and confessionalism and such in the study of religion, in the hopes that it could be opened up to our period. For instance, 1300 to 1900 is perhaps the least studied of history of Islam, and for very obvious reasons. It seems, again, Golden Age, decline, so on and so forth, but of course it has leapt well beyond Arabic into all sorts of other vernaculars, and this is the vernacular millennium. I think vernacular, Jamal, you used in your comments earlier on. But how do we move forward, given the fact that the constraints that you are facing are not just world historical constraints, but you're really rubbing off against well-entrenched trends in sub-areas of historical research?
Yes, John.
Just a quick sort of comment in terms of where we go. I think if you look at the people on the panel, none of us started as world history people. I mean, you know, nowadays there are a few programs where you have world history, but all of us started in particular studies and continue to be involved in particular studies. And I think that one of the interesting constraints that we have these days is that because of government finance, especially in the United States, the specific areas of study that we now call area studies, that those specific areas have been defined by financial support practices which were defined by the National Defense Education Act of 1958. And the world conceptually, in terms of our study centers, is the late 1958 world. And a lot of us, when I start saying, you know, the old area studies approach really needs to be changed, everybody goes pale if you're an administrator in an area studies center, because the people downtown in Washington are more than delighted to hear that they don't need to support area studies anymore, and they don't need to support humanities. But I think that what is required then is for us to make sure that there is a bridge. I mean, I don't see, for example, the flip side of yours, I don't see many of the people that I know in AAR at the meetings of the World History Association. You know, having a colleague who is the current president-elect or whatever of AAR, and a dean from 5 years ago who brainwashed all of Georgetown that, you know, with AAR, I think that what we've got right now is a battle that's a very, very old academic battle. I mean, a 50-year-old academic battle, 60-year-old academic battle, that the first bridge that needs to be jumped or needs to be built is still, unfortunately, between concrete cultural studies that has the label area studies and the disciplines. I mean, most of us have real difficulty in getting our political science colleagues to think that the specific studies of Islam are really important. Thank goodness, you know, I mean, this is one of those few things that the Ayatollah Khomeini helped us with.
Jerry? Yes.
Yeah, the short answer to your question, Ahmed, is the way to jumpstart these conversations and connections is to persuade people like Jamil and his colleagues to sacrifice about a year of their lives and organize a program such as this one. But short of that, there are other ways, and unfortunately it's not as well organized and it probably takes longer time. But for example, we all have our own networks of friends, contacts, you know, fellow graduate students and so forth, such as your colleague, Hal Parker, who is a friend of mine. And then this goes to another level when you and Hal get together and organize an NEH-sponsored summer seminar. And I think I just sent in the letter for that a week or so ago. So yeah, these things happen, and there is no single answer or formula, but there are ways in which the tentacles of individuals work through their networks, and eventually it does happen. Mills Kelly was sitting in the back a while earlier. I don't see him now. He may have left, but he was talking about how the Habsburg experts went through this same exercise, and it took them about 15 years, but they identified what were the supposed foundations of Habsburg decline, and then they all set about working on it, and at the end of 15 years they had dismantled the whole idea. So now they have to find another conversation.
I would like to add my comment on this. I mean, I think I'm a comparativist, as you all know, and I do think about China and these other empires. But one, I think I'm glad that you raised this issue, is that compared to the Habsburg and the Chinese, we have a more difficult challenge. I mean, if it was only the Ottoman Empire, it could have been much easier. But we have, because we talk about a religious tradition, then things get much more complex. I mean, China, we don't talk about Confucianism or Confucian decline, we're going to talk about China, and then it gets recovered. And what I see happening is that we have one problem is talking about Islam as if it's something that is out there. And then I think colleagues at AAR can help us in that. And the second one is that this idea of certain idea of Islamic history that I studied, its origins, the Golden Age and decline, became a foundational pillar of modern Muslim identity. So even we try to convince our non-Muslim audiences, the Muslim audiences are going to have the hardest time to give up on the decline because they are tied to the Golden Age. I mean, I think Nihad is there. I mean, if you fight against this sort of stereotype of Muslims, I think if you want to get rid of the Muslim decline and the dehumanization that they're outside of modernity, we have to get rid of the Golden Age. And Muslims are the most reluctant group who would like to get rid of the Golden Age. I don't know why, but that makes it very complicated. I think once you have the Golden Age, the decline automatically comes in. And once you have the decline, then the Muslims are outside of modern life, or they are outside of American culture, they have no contribution. So things get more complicated, and we might need more workshops and meetings than the Habsburg colleagues did. But we have 3 questions, so I will start with you, and brief questions, and then colleagues in the back.
Amal Gumati, University of York, and also representing Foundation for Science, Technology, and Civilization. Actually, the interesting point about the Hajj, and earlier on, I think it was Kamal Gafadar who said the public space or public square, or the lack of public square in the Muslim civilization, which actually surprised me a great deal. And in that context,
no, I was being ironic.
Okay,
that's what people say.
I'll withdraw this one then. But actually, in parallel to that is the fatwa. And I will, in that context, I will take Imam Malik when he said that the divorce of someone who is being oppressed to give a divorce is not allowed. And actually what he meant is that the bay'ah to the Khalifa is not allowed. And that happened actually in the mosque, which I'd like, again, perhaps in studying the Hajj and the history of the Hajj, also to take that concealed fatwa, which has been enlightening people. And perhaps in the Tahrir Square, in much the same way like the people in Tahrir Square have reclaimed a meaning, a true meaning of the word jihad, which we only unfortunately understand in the context of the Taliban and groups like this, while it is the Prophet hadith of أفضل الجهاد كلمة عدل عند سلطان جائر, the best form of jihad is that word of truth at a tyrant ruler, which is very, very important. The last comment is actually about Toby Hobbes and his book. And when I look at that and say, well, all right, when I'm writing my arithmetic, I'm a physicist in electronics and all of that, and the Arab numerals, where on earth have they come from, and algebra and all of that? And again, it is sad to see some of the modern, inverted commas, writers taking the word madrasa in the context of the Taliban again. And again, we, the academic community, need to reclaim the true meaning of the words rather than giving them to the Toby Hobbes of this world. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Because of the time problem, I will ask Nihad to intervene and then maybe get Hussein and Himmet. Did you have something? And quickly, and then we will round up the panel.
I just would like to say that I have a personal interest in learning so much from not only the presenters but the participants here, because I see a huge gap growing every day between the reality of the history of Islam within that period before or even just maybe 100 years old, and the perception in the one of the most advanced societies like the United States. And as an activist in anti-defamation and civil rights activist for the Council on American Islamic Relations, where the rubber meets the road every day, we battle these wrong perceptions about Islam and Muslims. We get battered also for trying to defend at least what we know about Islam. So I welcome the opportunity to learn more about you, and I would like to see your knowledge being displayed on networks like Fox News. And I'm sure many people share this desire with me. But I understand from the earlier comments that you are not the majority in the world academia, and probably you have your own challenges. I would like to learn more from you. How can we fix the material that's being written about Islam and Muslims in American textbooks? What kind of challenges you face? You are historians, and I'm sure you feel that for some reason what you know is not in the textbook, and you always feel confronted with the reality that you know it. So I have a personal interest in learning more about your work, because we work with the public almost on every day. I would like to connect with you, invite you for conferences, recommend you to the media, not only Fox, but other networks, and share your knowledge and educate people about what you know. Thank you.
So why don't we have your quick question, and then we end the panelists.
Thank you. Hussein Yilmaz, University of South Florida. Whether accidental or not, all the panelists are from the US. And now we are talking about world history. And my question is, thanks to a number of studies like Hayrettin Yücesoy's, in different contexts, people may envision world in a dramatically different way. Just a quick example, in Katip Çelebi's translation of Atlas, he starts from Japan. He says European geographers start with Europe and end with Japan, but I will start from Japan and end with Europe. So that's at least a different conception of the Earth. So my specific question is, how this world history written, produced, and contemplated here in U.S. Factor of knowledge production communicate with other world histories written and contemplated in, say, India, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, South America. Thank you.
Well, last words, panel. Maybe we start with John Voll and then you come towards you.
I think that your question provides just sort of a nice link to end with, and that is that everybody's emphasizing network, exchange of knowledge, information, and so on. And the specific answer to your question could be the World History Association is no longer necessarily North American or WASP, even though it may look this way. But I would call your attention to the meeting of the World History Association that is upcoming during this summer, which is in Beijing. And in fact, it is doing very solid work with people developing world history and concepts of Middle Eastern and Islamic history in China.
Well, and then I can add to that if you want to see a bit of a record of current efforts to coordinate work by world historians in various different countries, you can try the world's longest acronym, NOGWHISTO, the Network of Global and World History Organizations, which formed and was admitted to the Congress of Historical Sciences last August. It includes in addition to the World History Association in North America, the European Network in Universal and Global History, the Asian Association of World Historians, which is pretty well established now, the African Network in Global History, which is scheduled to meet in Cairo next September, but I bet meeting ends up being postponed for a bit, and a Latin American group in formation. There's the Asian Association of World Historians is seeking to define Asia very broadly, and so there was just last week a visit by a scholar based in Malaysia to Qatar, to the university there, to address faculty and students on world history. So I think that the development of local discussions in various parts of the world on the larger issues in history and culture is something that's very much on the agenda, but in some areas it does seem to be progressing.
I have just a couple of thoughts to add, and one of them is the biggest one is just to say that people who are scholars of the Middle East and Islam have a very strong interest to frequent the meetings of the World History Association and to make their ideas known, to publish in its journals. In addition to the Journal of World History, there's also a Journal of Global History that comes out of London. And so the field has begun to really emerge in important ways. The AP World History exam is now an exam that is taken by the third or fourth most taken AP exam. There are world history standards in 46 states, et cetera. So there's this huge mushrooming thing from below. It's really, most of the action is really in classrooms and in junior colleges, and it's only recently is this wave begun really getting into the curricula and into the research end of things at research universities. So this is a very fertile time to be doing this. A lot of world historians operate with a framework about Middle East and Islam that is based largely on outdated scholarship. And so it's very important to make your ideas known and to try and find some intellectual terms of trade to engage.
Ditto John, ditto Pat, ditto Terry. And we still have a problem because the bulk of the discourse is indeed North American and to a lesser extent European, Australasian, and so forth. We have tried strenuously to make places for other voices. I'm sure there are other very different ways of thinking about the same world that we envision in one way if you come from other parts. And all I can say is we want to foster the conversations in the Journal of World History, as Terry mentioned, Journal of Global History at our conferences. Now it takes some people to advance themselves and to start participating from different perspectives in the conversation. Maybe that's beginning to happen. We have No Gusto. We had a conference in not only in Beijing next summer, but 6 years ago, I guess it was, in Morocco, thanks to Terry's efforts. And we have had a few conversations with people coming from different perspectives, but not enough. So don't think that it's not because we're sitting up here and trying to exclude people. We would love to have a larger conversation. But let me just give a common response to the last 2 points, and that is, I mean, your intervention as well, and that is, world history is a long-term project. It's not going to happen in a few years. It is absolutely mind-blowing what the AP World History course has done in 10 years, but even with that, we are only a fraction of the way towards any kind of a goal that we would like to reach. We're talking about a generational project. Maybe a couple of, I mean, who knows? But it's going to take a while before the kind of knowledge that we are all asking for becomes common knowledge. But I think we're in it for the longer haul, and we would like to engage in conversation with people coming from different perspectives along the way.
Thank you all. With great embarrassment that I would have given voice to many others who want to make comments, but I think we are already 10 minutes late. We should have our coffee and tea and meet you again at 4:35.